Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in downtown Washington, D.C. at the Washington headquarters for the International Institute for Strategic Studies, one of the world's most important think tanks headquartered in London. And we have with us Bastian Giegerich, who is the Director of Military Studies at IISS. Great to see you. You've spent a couple of days in Washington. It coincided with Jean-Claude Juncker's meeting with President Trump. Give us your sense. How productive was that meeting, Bastian, in terms of sort of remedying what is an increasingly strained relationship with Europe, particularly after some of the comments the President made calling the EU a foe? How important was this agreement that the President struck with Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Union President?
Vago, it's good to see you. Well, let me start by saying after the NATO summit and after some of the comments that the President made about the EU, it felt like we are present at the destruction of that order that we come to rely on. So in that sense, starting from that point, I think the agreement that we've seen, even though it is vague, I think will strike a positive tone, it will strike a positive note, because simply it means some of the potentially disastrous steps regarding tariffs have, at least for the time being, been taken off the table. So in that sense, at the very least, provides a bit of relief from that pressure that we've seen build up over the last couple of weeks.
That meeting was positive after what can be called perhaps a roller coaster NATO meeting, and then we also had the Putin-Trump summit in Helsinki. From your standpoint, having watched closely both events, to walk us through what you saw positive, what you saw negative from a European perspective at a time, and then I want to follow up with a little bit about how governments in Europe are making their own plans very, very quietly about how they maybe intend to hedge their bets from a strategic standpoint.
Yeah, I think when we look at the NATO summit in Brussels and then the Helsinki meeting, it's almost as if we have to watch several chessboards at the same time now. There is, in Brussels, I mean, you will have seen the communique that came out of the summit, which is a reasonable document. It pursues the tasks that have been outlined at the 2014 Wales Summit, the 2016 Warsaw Summit, and it provides a reasonable agenda to take that forward, to work on deterrence and defense, to strengthen that around military mobility, around military readiness, all big ticket items where Europeans have a lot of catch up to do, where if we get on with these items, they will make a positive difference. So I think that's all there. The problem is that on that other chessboard, we saw chaos. We saw the NATO Secretary General being publicly humiliated by the U.S. President even before the meeting began. We had a fairly quiet day one of the summit when everybody thought like, okay, we're getting somewhere. And then we had day two, which descended into an emergency meeting triggered by Trump making demands that everybody should be meeting the 2% spending target by next year, which isn't anywhere near an agreed position.
And then 4%, right? I mean, he increased this idea that everybody had agreed to a 4% increase, which Macron and other leaders, dismissed shortly after the meeting.
Yeah, I think there was a sense of European leaders have given part of the answer that Trump actually wanted to hear, which is they are spending more money. They've started spending more money before he became president, but let's give him credit in the sense that yes, Europeans need to spend more money on defense. He put pressure on that point. That is certainly an issue that Europeans will have to address. They have begun to address it. He's moving the goalposts, and European leaders afterwards have said, no, the goalposts are still what we actually agreed them to be all together at these previous summits. So there is a positive dynamic actually underway for a variety of reasons. Europeans are beginning to understand that the threat picture has changed, that they actually need to invest in defense. They also understand that the 2 decades of defense cuts have left real holes in their armed forces, in their inventories, in their capability. When you look at readiness, real problems there, and they want to close those gaps and want to deal with these problems. And they have more fiscal space now. The economic situation is better than it was even just a few years ago. So those are the underlying factors that lead to a change in the defense economic conversation in Europe. And then to that you add as the fourth element the pressure from the US. But to me, that's very much the fourth element. It's not number 1, 2, and 3. It is helpful to a degree. That's why every administration before this one has put pressure on Europeans. What is not helpful is that sense of bullying that did come through, because I think what the president might not quite see is that when he produces this drama to which he then provides relief in a press conference, that destroys a lot of trust among the allies. And an alliance is based on trust. It is based on everybody around the table trusting everybody else to provide solidarity, to stand in for each other, and that requires a certain type of behavior, a certain conduct, if you want, that I think we haven't quite seen from the president at this NATO summit.
And what about the Putin-Trump meeting? It was extraordinary in that the Russians, the president had an interpreter with them. Putin had an interpreter, but also note takers and other people who were in the meeting from his side. And then there was, of course, that was a 2-hour meeting, and then there was the press conference that followed. From a European perspective, what were the key takeaways? The president's point of view is it's important to have a candid and frank dialogue with another nuclear power, the Russians, and that it's important to have good relations whether or not you agree with them or not. How was the meeting and that press conference received by European leaders?
Well, I think, again, we have an interesting situation that you could actually find quite a lot of people in Europe who would say, yes, dialogue is a good idea. I'm German. In my country, you will find a significant part of the political spectrum that says dialogue with Russia is important and it should happen and it needs to be part of that conversation. Yes, there needs to be deterrence and defense, but there certainly needs to be dialogue. But the dialogue that we have seen is very worrying. And the dialogue we have seen does nothing on the European side to build trust towards this US administration, where I don't think there's any sense of what actually was discussed. I don't think there's any readout on what kind of decisions might have been put on the table that have an effect on European security. So I think European leaders actually don't have a good read of the situation because they don't know the facts. They don't know the content of the conversation, and I think that deeply worries them. And then we're not even yet talking about that moment when it seemed that the U.S. president was willing to put more trust in the words of President Putin than his own intelligence services. So that obviously is disturbing to see, frankly, from a European point of view.
There are, I know one of the concerns that European leaders, I mean, as you said, what was agreed. There's a lot of talk in a lot of circles. I've heard British senior officers, in fact, raise this issue. I've heard American senior leaders raise this issue about expansion. NATO pushed too hard, too fast. The Baltics should never have been part of it. The Balkans should never have been part of, that was really encroaching. That's provocative. We have to see this from a Russian perspective. We shouldn't have done it. Is there a concern that you have, as somebody who watches closely the alliance, that there is almost like an eroding of it, where people are now more comfortable saying, boy, we never should have to fight a war over Lithuania, for example. That's not a discussion you can even have now at this point because it's a nation that's in the alliance. Do you have that concern that this rift, this tension is sort of bubbling up, very potentially damaging even ideas for the future of the alliance?
Yeah, I think I would look at it in a slightly different vein. I think if we actually had a situation where there was a discussion that would say, we're not ready to defend a NATO ally, I think that's the end of the alliance, frankly. So I don't think that's quite what we're seeing. I think, though, there is a question about whether alliance deterrence posture, the alliance deterrence posture is perhaps from a political, not military, but political point of view, a lot more brittle than we seem to think. I mean, we've seen some polling data in Germany that more Germans trust Russia than they trust the U.S. now. I mean, to me, that's a terrifying insight. That, to me, is a sign that that order that we thought European security is based on is at least a lot more volatile than we like to believe, and that can be corrosive. That can be dangerous. You know, I think comments about some recent NATO members, again from the U.S. president, that they might be in the business of triggering World War III. I mean, those are all comments that are not helpful at all. They go against what NATO stands for, and the problem is that it makes it more and more difficult for all these transatlanticists in Europe to talk about NATO as an alliance of values, of shared values and shared interests, because frankly, that sounds very hollow at this point in time.
Germany is one of the nations in Europe that has still a roaring economy. We were talking about the fact that despite all of these strains, the economies continue to grow. But even an exploding rocket really keeps going up and down range a little bit farther, perhaps. Not suggesting that anything is exploding at this time, but there are strains on what is a rising economy. Germany has a very large budget surplus, I think 120 million euros. You would think that this would be, especially with a very strong defense minister, Ursula von der Leyen, who recognizes the challenges and the shortfalls in the German military to address readiness. There was that submarine issue. Germany prides itself on one of the world's best submarine forces, but all the subs were tied up. You have seen ground forces readiness issues. Luftwaffe has also had some readiness shortcomings. But what's the challenge she faces about getting some of that money, even if Angela Merkel is willing to give it to her, which she seems willing to do it? There are other political pressures. Talk to us about the political pressures within Germany, even with a nation with a surplus that nationally recognizes it has to do more for its military, why it will find it very difficult to do anything for its military.
Yeah, it's an interesting paradox because, as you say, structurally Germany would be able to spend more on defense. It has plans in place to spend more on defense, not getting to the 2%, but getting from just under 1.2 to 1.5% of GDP by 2024. So, I mean, that's significant. That's a significant amount of money, but there could clearly be more. And you have an interesting situation. You have, with Ursula von der Leyen, you have a defense minister who wants to spend more money, who understands the readiness issues, which arose at a time when she wasn't minister yet. She's been trying to deal with them. She hasn't had a smashing success there yet, but it takes time. She knows that requires more money. She has done, I would say, a decent job convincing her own party, including the Chancellor, that that is actually a reasonable request. That wasn't an instant situation as well. That took political leadership on her part. She has now, but of course she's part of a coalition government, and the Social Democrats who hold the finance ministry and the foreign ministry look at this a bit differently. And so the next challenge, after she had convinced her own party that this is a good idea, she now has to work on the coalition partner. And there we are beginning to see some signs. A few weeks ago, we had rhetoric coming out of the Social Democratic Party that was deeply unhelpful when they said, you know, there's a play on words that works in German when you say, you know, mehr Ausrüstung darf nicht mehr Aufrüstung sein, which basically translates into re-equipment shouldn't mean rearmament. But that's not what the plans are about. They're actually about re-equipping a hollow force at this point. It's really about rebuilding what we lost over a decade and a half. But it means there is part of the political spectrum in Germany that looks at more defense spending with a lot of skepticism, in part because of German history, in part because of policy preferences that would emphasize other means. And that's a legitimate position. So she has to deal with that. She has to address that. Now, the problem is doing so becomes more difficult when there is extreme and unreasonable pressure from the hegemon in the alliance, the United States. So when you then are in the middle of explaining your plans for more defense spending, and then someone says, well, the goal has just changed from 2% to 4%, that makes the job a lot harder for Ursula von der Leyen. She has to then explain again why she needs more money and why it is for rebuilding capability, because the threat environment has changed, because we have gaps, because we have massive readiness problems, because it will look like it's just a response to bullying from Washington. And that's not a political argument that she can win. So one has to understand that some of these political leaders, even though they want to move in that direction, they need a bit of political space to actually make a public case for why this is necessary. And to my view, if that can be based on an analysis of the threat environment, of an analysis of the state of those armed forces, that's much more sustainable in the long run than if it is based on pressure from the United States. I accept some pressure is helpful, but not the way it is done at this moment.
The administration's model a little bit has been spend more, spend it with us, give us trade concessions, and you will get security, a message that has gone over not particularly well, I think, in Europe. The question is, there are folks in Washington who are convinced that no matter what's said, the alliance will survive, and allies ultimately will buy systems from the United States because, you know, they're good, they're available, it improves interoperability, and countries will want to buy from the United States to get America's attention, for example, in the event of a crisis. From your perspective, and some of the messages I was hearing quietly at Farnborough, at the Royal International Air Tattoo, but in conversations I've had over the last few months, is that governments appear to be reconsidering fundamentally even some of the big decisions, given that their attitude is, well, wait a minute, if we're going to spend more money, let's spend it at home and bolster our capabilities. Do you think that this is going to cause sort of European countries that have depended for decades on American systems to start to go their own way or go into European collaborative programs or to acquire European systems? I mean, Germany, for example, is under enormous pressure to buy the F-35. There are people in Germany who think, look, this is great, it'll quiet the president down, it will appease him. On the other hand, there are people who say, you know, we shouldn't be in that position. Talk to us a little bit about how governments are thinking and reconsidering how they stay in an alliance, how they stay close to Washington, but then also sort of hedge their bets in some cases.
Yeah. I mean, the trend that we see coming from this administration here to link trade and security in that trade-off that you alluded to, I think that has certainly not gone unnoticed in the U.S. I mean, I used to joke a few weeks ago, you know, I'm German and I drive a BMW, but I come in peace. You know, it's like it's really it has reached that level of irony where there are some connections that come out of the policy conversation here that are just hard to understand, frankly, in Europe. But more to the point on defense and what it might mean for defense industrial landscape and what it might mean for some of the decisions that are about to be made in Europe. I think there is a danger there that Europe looks at this and makes a decision that it should become a closed shop. It should achieve autonomy, not in a collaborative way, not in a sense that involves partners, but in an autarky type way, which I think will be deeply unhelpful in the long run. But you know, you can see how, if you're a politician, in the short run, you might get some jobs out of it, you might get some votes out of it. So I think there's a real danger there that kind of sentiment gets more traction, and if we're unlucky, it actually gets supported by some of these new EU initiatives that we've seen, where there's EU funding for defense research and development now coming online. And there are rules that are being defined about third-party participation in some of these projects. And depending on how these rules are being defined, you could end up with a situation where barriers go down inside that EU defense equipment market, but they go up on the outside. And that, I think, from a larger defense industrial ecosystem point of view, is not helpful. But what you're seeing is clearly that's a consequence of a political assessment where the assessment is actually the one that has been expressed by Angela Merkel now 2-3 times. At this point in time, we cannot be sure that the US is a reliable partner, and therefore we need to do more to stand on our own 2 feet, and that includes defense industry. If you now look at the EU global strategy on foreign security policy, it mentions strategic autonomy as one of the key goals. When it came out in 2016, nobody cared much about what that might mean, and nobody had much of an idea of what that might mean. But now there's a real discussion underway. Well, how do we fill this with life? And to me, it seems that there are 3 elements to it. It's decision-making, it's capability, and it's defense industry. And so I think that dynamic is underway. It happens at a time when the European Commission has begun to look at defense as a potential prosperity story, a prosperity narrative, which the Commission has never done before, and wouldn't have touched it with a 10-foot pole. But now they have seen the potential for that story to unfold. So you can have a confluence of factors from the national level, from the multinational level in the EU, and externally where the US creates an external stimulus to pursue this agenda, where a lot of European governments might make a decision. You know what? When we assess these things, there's a soft buy European preference creeping in, and it becomes more of a hedging game. You mentioned F-35 as one of the platforms that several European countries are looking at. And to me, it's not a foregone conclusion which way this will fall, whether governments will say, well, actually, buying F-35 is a means to relieve the pressure coming from the US, or whether they will say, actually, with this pressure on, let's invest in our own capacity. For Europe to be competitive, I think it has to be done together. It has to be done in a multinational situation. You would have, if you're talking about combat air, you would have to have those leading aerospace nations in Europe to come together and actually decide, where are the centers of excellence, and can you build something around those rather than duplicating. So, for example, for the new UK plan, Tempest. I think down the line, that's actually the question: where will the partnerships be? Even though it's set out to be a national ambition, but I think down the line there will be those questions: where are the partners, and what do they bring, and how quickly can we get them to join in and help pay for this?
You're German. You speak defense. You drive a BMW, and yet you're very English. You live in Cambridge, beautiful, a very nice part of Cambridge that you live in. So you're very Brexit susceptible. Talk to us a little bit about the security implications here, because you and I were talking a little bit about how far Theresa May has come. The battles she's had to wage internally. There were high-profile defections from her cabinet, including her procurement minister, who we taped with, not knowing that a few hours later he was going to resign from the cabinet to vote against the government. In terms of the sort of the slight hardening of terms that we saw there, the vote that she narrowly won. The Brits have sort of said, look, NATO remains the anchor, so we're not going to be in the EU, but we're still going to be anchored, preferably on preferential trade terms, but then we're going to strike this accord with the United States and have this trade pact. There were some fractures on that when the president visited and his interview with The Sun, among other things, that surprised the prime minister, who was hosting him for dinner just a couple of hours after the interview. Talk to us about the British dynamic here and how this ends up. Because depending on how you look at it, Britain could end up being hurt in this process, which would be a very bad thing for a country that is, if not, certainly one of the security leaders, if not the most prominent security nation in Europe.
Yeah, I think that's a real risk there, that the UK ends up losing influence with the two camps, so to speak, that actually underpin its multinational security and defense engagement and policy, and there's of course NATO and the EU. And I think the rationale was, when the Brexit referendum happened and when that all unfolded, was, well, we will have NATO will be strong, and that will be the anchor. Now, of course, NATO looks more fragile than perhaps we thought 2.5 years ago. So I think that changes the equation a little bit. I think that is part of why the United Kingdom, the government, Theresa May's government, has been keen to work out the terms for a security partnership with the EU post-Brexit. And I think they have made a good point to say the UK can bring something to the table: capability, experience, willingness to lead. All these things without which strategic autonomy sounds pretty hollow to me. Very important things. But they've also said we need, therefore, because we bring these things to the table, we need to have a role that is consummate to that what we bring. And the EU has been slow to recognize what that might mean in terms of decision shaping, possibly in some project level activities, decision-making powers, carving out a role for the UK that is better than just giving them third-party status, like just say you're just like another Norway, which is in NATO but not in the EU, is affiliated with a lot of these activities, including in security and defense, including with the European Defense Agency, but has a very limited role actually to play. The UK is not Norway in defense. I mean, with all respect to Norwegians, the UK brings something different to the table. That should be recognized. It hasn't yet. So I think that's a tricky situation. And to me, really, it should be a situation that can be resolved, because at the end of the day, when the British government looks at European security challenges and every other EU member state government looks at security challenges, I'd ask them, well, name one where less cooperation is the answer. And I don't think that's possible. So if that's the situation, then clearly we need to work towards some sort of compromise. I think for the NATO angle, I think there is some worry in London right now that the US is not delivering what was hoped for. The British government has, when this US administration came in, has made a bet that basically went like, well, we're going to be very close to them, and we're going to be not very critical, unlike Merkel at the time, and we're going to hug them close and hope for good results. And I don't think those results have materialized. If anything, Trump's interventions into the British debate have made things more difficult for Theresa May. So I think that would create a little bit of discomfort in London when it comes to, well, where will we fall through the cracks here? Is our influence on the wane, both with the US and with our European partners, in part because of decisions we, the Brits, have made, but in part also because the situation has changed around us. What I don't dare to speculate about at this point is, what does that lead to? Does that lead to a second referendum? Does that lead to a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit? I think at this point, all of those options are possible. All of them have different costs and benefits. I think Theresa May at this point, to me, looks a little bit stronger than she looked a few weeks ago. I think even though her checkers plan immediately came under fire, there were resignations. Actually, she used it to take control personally of the Brexit negotiations. I think in that sense, we'll have to see how that plays out now, but I think she has used that. I'm not going to say it was planned, but she's used that dynamic at the moment to strengthen her hand. We'll see what she does with it.
And last question. Jim Mattis sent a letter to Gavin Williamson saying spend more than 2%, otherwise Britain would lose its special relationship with the United States, and then added something which to a Brit is sort of the ultimate indignity: you will be replaced by Paris, yes. Which I understand that was done to bolster Gavin Williamson's hand in negotiating with Theresa May for more money. He's been pushing for 3%, saying that Britain's unique role in the world, and post-Brexit, and we're a global nation, we've got to bolster our capabilities. And I think there are a lot of people who would agree that, if one country was going to figure out how to invest that money to expand its military capacity back to a more global footprint, it would be the Brits. But the question is, post-Brexit, doesn't Britain, by definition, become, Britain was a key avenue for Washington to influence the EU. If Britain is not at that table, doesn't the United States have to work through Paris, Berlin, and Rome, or Amsterdam and Madrid as well, to help steer a ship that was, or influence a ship that was much more easily done straight through London, which did have a tendency of sort of representing America's views at the table? Just two-part question, I guess. One is, on the money gambit, is Gavin Williamson going to get more money? But the secondary piece is, irrespective of how much money Britain spends, doesn't Britain's voice in Washington get diminished somewhat, whether anybody likes it or not, simply because it's not sitting at the EU table?
I think it will. I think that's a natural consequence of the decision to leave the European Union. I think, and I think the Obama administration understood this and actually said as much to the British government, and that caused a bit of a backlash in the UK. Why are you meddling, funnily enough, in our domestic conversation?
Well, in that case, it was meddling on behalf of a sitting prime minister who asked him to meddle on his behalf.
Well, that's why I said, funny enough, it's meddling of the good kind that still does exist every now and then. But I think the point is a political one, as you've said. The U.S. administration will have to work through the other capitals, including Brussels, which you didn't mention. But I think,
sorry about that for everybody in Brussels.
but I think that's also on the agenda. But I would say it's not just the administration. It's also defense aerospace companies who usually have used the UK as literally their bridge into Europe, and usually run their Europe operations out of the UK. They might want to look at that model because it's not clear to me that will still be viable if we get an acrimonious Brexit or just simply a crashing out of the EU, because it will make things more difficult. So I think it affects industry, the private sector, it affects government, and I think the UK will have lost some standing there simply as a result of this decision. So I think that will certainly take place. And I think, remind me the other part of that.
And the other question was the 3% question, right? Gavin Williamson has been pushing for 3%. Is he likely to get this, or is this just a pipe dream, or just an effort to even squeeze that number up a little bit? Because actually, if you look at the contraction of the British economy a little bit, right, that number has gone to 1.9% or something. Excuse me. Let me ask that again, because it's down to 1.9%. Of GDP for some reason. But anyway, let me ask it again. So the other question is the 3% figure. Gavin Williamson and his allies have been pushing for that, saying that, look, for too long we've been trying to stretch things to try to cover it. There are readiness shortfalls, there are personnel shortfalls, there are weapons shortfalls. So every dollar is directed toward acquisition by cutting and playing, kind of a financial shell game. And even now there's talk of another £750 million in efficiencies that will have to come out of the next strategic defense and security review. From your perspective, is it reasonable? Can Britain do it? Will Britain do it? Will there be an increase in defense spending? Or is this period going to be so difficult financially that the department may be lucky to stick with 2%, much less be able to get 3%?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way Brexit could have two effects. It could lead to less economic growth, which makes it a little easier to meet an increasing percentage of GDP spent on defense. But that wouldn't be a good news story, obviously. Or it could indeed lead to a focus on a particular portfolio and more expenditure there. At the moment, I would look at this and say the problem is, the UK hasn't really balanced its resources with its ambition from the 2010 SDSR to the 2015 SDSR, and what will now come out of the modernizing defense program, which by now is really another defense review, or a defense review by another name. It was meant to be done already. We just, I think last week, got an update in Parliament on where they are. It still looks like a work in progress to me. There's a lot of talk about organizational changes, efficiency savings, but those are not, to me, the main questions. The main question is really, what are you going to do about your equipment program? What are you going to do long-term to raise the game again? And funnily enough, when Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of Defense, made that argument. We need to remain a top-tier, Tier 1 military power. Theresa May reportedly asked him, well, why, and what does that mean? And so I think that's an interesting signal that this is not a foregone conclusion that he will get more money. There is pressure from other budgets, health, other more social welfare, NHS related spending priorities that I think feature a little higher in the average Briton's perspective or priority order. So I think this will be difficult. I think my guess would be there will be a bit more money, but it won't be enough to close the gaps that have been the shortfalls that have been identified. I don't think efficiency savings will get him there. They tend to be elusive, unfortunately. So I think unless there's more money on the table, it will be really difficult for the UK to make this modernizing defense program a success. My bet would be there's going to be a bit more money, but not enough to see that through.
Bastian Giegerich of the IISS. It's always a pleasure. Great seeing you. Hope you had a productive visit to our shores and look forward to seeing you soon in London.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Vago. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.